Hello everybody, welcome to Psych of Motivation here, and we're going to start off here with Chapter 14, the Freudian unconscious and this unconscious motivation. I spent all the time on my dissertation trying to discover and demonstrate, in fact, that non-conscious emotion existed. Freud was talking about unconscious motivation from kind of the very beginning of his theorization. So we're going to take some time looking at that. And here's a famous Freudian quote. You'll see this quote in many places about Freud, perhaps. Time spent with cats is never wasted. I resonate to the quote because I get a lot of freaking cats. But it's weird. If you go to attribute this quote and find out exactly where he said it, it's like impossible to find. So did he ever say it at all? And we don't know, right? But there's certainly a lot of people who attribute this quote and have sold all kinds of gotchkes like coffee cups, etc., with this written on it and attributing it to Freud, but maybe he never said it at all. What we do know is Freud was a very intense dog lover. He loved dogs, but cats, it remains kind of unknown. So there's Brain and Digby kind of hanging out. So before we begin, we've got to say this about psychoanalytic theory. It's rife with misinterpretation and misunderstanding. And I think Freudian theory and Sigmund Freud has become one of the central whipping boys in psychology. If there's someone to beat up on, if there's someone to point to and say, look at how ridiculous psychology is. Freud said that we all want to sleep with our mothers, and then we dismiss it out of hand. And yeah, Freud has a lot of strange issues, but he's got a lot of solid ideas in theory that still stand up well today. So this is something that we do, we take with an open mind, right? And we look at the pros and cons, and we look for evidence, and where it's lacking, then we kind of push those ideas to the back burner. Where empirical evidence supports the ideas, then we can continue to embrace them. I'm a big fan of Freudian theory. Although as a social psychologist, we often shed the term unconscious because it was Freudian and kind of latched on in the 1980s, 1990s to the term non-conscious, that being not Freudian and more modern. So maybe it was because social psychologists, empirically oriented social psychologists, didn't really want to kind of have themselves tied to Freud. Regardless, the theory is idiosyncratic and it's complex. Evidence to support the theory was collected via non-experimental paradigms. It was really the case study method that shined through Freud's work, and that's what was done at that time. Freud's concepts were far-ranging, they were evolving. He touched on a lot of ideas, had a lot of theory, was steeped in history, the antiquities, Greek, Latin. So going way back, Egyptian, he collected artwork, from all over the world, although he didn't buy his artwork all over the world and travel all over the world. Most of his pieces were purchased in shops around Vienna, Austria, when he lived there. So, but he was always kind of evolving his ideas. And it makes operationalization then of his concepts kind of a Herculean task, if you will, according to Halarches, that he largely left to others. And he didn't revisit a lot of his work. So as Freud is theorizing and writing books, then he might evolve his nature of thinking, and he doesn't return and put out a new edition of the old book, kind of updating what he said before. So Freud is continually a work in progress and a fascinating person to consider and study if you're willing to step back to when empiricism wasn't necessarily required, when psychology was more philosophical, right? And those of us who have our PhDs in psychology, if we got it from Ohio State, we got this nice, doctorate certificate, but it's doctorate of philosophy, right? Not doctor of psychology. And so that's the proximity of psychology and philosophy. In Psych of Emotion, we really start with philosophy and move towards psychology. Freud's dual instinct theory then, really, there's two instincts. Eros is the instinct for life, for creation, and then this drives us towards the idea of sex, for procreation, right? The nurturance is part of Eros and giving, to affiliate with others. And Freud was pretty well armed with this idea, this eros, this instinct for life, until World War I. And then once World War I transpires and you see massive death at unheard of levels for history, then people come back to Freud and they say, dude, what's the deal with this eros? And then how do you explain World War I? And obviously then the need for another instinct emerges, named thus thanatos, that is the death instinct, right? And this is aggression towards the self, maybe an urge to self-punish, if you will, self-criticism that leads to depression. And one of then the defense mechanisms, if thanatos is taking too large a part of our psyches, then one of the defense mechanisms is to turn that outward, turn aggression outward. Quincy, get down from there. Come here, Quincy. Sorry about that, but we have the inevitable cat interruptions. I don't know what the hell he was trying to do, but it was something he shouldn't be doing. I just know it, right? So, the dynamic hypothesis then of intrapsychic conflict and strong motivational power from this, right? All behavior is dynamically motivated. Motivation arises as the process of unconscious intrapsychic conflict. So we have instinctual drives, thanatos and eros, if you will, that take on psychical representations, and then to control these we use various defense mechanisms, but then the urges, the motivations are in conflict with the defenses, and this motivates us to find compromises or compromise formations. So neither complete expression nor complete restraint is possible. There's always this tension between trying to get it done, but then inhibiting that action for various reasons, and we'll look at the mechanisms that are involved in this. So, and when you think psychodynamic, it's a perfect label, it's a perfect term for this, because the psyche is dynamic. We have societal inhibitions on one side, and we have urges on another. We have internalized rules and regulations that we want to follow, but then we might have desires that conflict with those. So we are creatures in tension, right? So it's motivational from every aspect in every direction. Freud's libido, one's energy or life force, is created by the survival and sexual instincts. So the purpose of libido is to move us forward. It is to get us up off the couch, right? And it's, in the service of survival, it's in the service of sexual instincts, and it can be tied to pleasure principle, that is the seeking of pleasure, or, if you will, and Freud used some weird terms, the avoidance of unpleasure, right? So the expression of libido is tied to one's psychosexual stages. And these psychosexual stages are one idea that kind of gets Freud into trouble, because he talks about the 4 stages that we go through till we reach adulthood, adolescence, whatever you want to call it. And he calls these psychosexual stages, and basically the need center, the pleasure center, is moving as we from the time we're born to the time we reach adolescence. And the term psychosexual, I think, was unfortunate, because it's tied to pleasure, but let's face it, a 2-year-old is not capable of sexual pleasure. I think had Freud, and I know I shouldn't rewrite Freud, but I think had Freud labeled these psychosensual pleasure, then it would have resonated a great deal more to people than it does now. It's easy to dismiss psychosexual, 3-year-old sexual, whatever, I'm out of here, I don't even want to listen. But if we think in terms of sensual, right, and we look at the major life challenges from birth to adolescence, we can see the pleasure center moving, right? And Freud talked about the oral stage, where pleasure is received orally, and this would be a newborn, right, up to toddler point in time. And think about it, Piaget would kind of agree with this sensory motor period, and it overlaps with the infancy period for Freud. That is, pleasure is derived through the mouth, and this is how he calls it the oral stage. And then when we hit toddlerhood and we go through potty training, much of our challenge is to learn to control our bathroom habits, right? So we either tighten the sphincter or we loosen it, and either can represent a pleasurable experience of controlling the sphincter muscle, and the pleasure of releasing it at the appropriate time. That is when we're appropriately attired and sitting on the toilet, potty seat, etc. So the pleasure then is at the anus, and that would be the anal stage. I know that sounds weird, but if we talk in terms of pleasure rather than sex, and pleasure will become predominated by sex at adolescence with the hormonal changes. So it's not a far cry. With a little rewrite, it becomes, I think, a little more palatable to most audiences and makes a little more sense. Now, this libidinal energy is limited in supply, and different mental processes complete for the libidinal energy. So we might be trying to inhibit to not say something because we're afraid it will make us look bad, or we say if we know that if we say it, it's going to hurt the other person's feeling, and then we're going to feel guilty. So we try to inhibit saying these things as inappropriate, or they might bring punishment down on us. But notice we only have so much energy. And we're going to tap into this idea of libidinal force in terms of ego depletion with Baumeister at a later time. But bottom line, libidinal energy is not it's not unlimited. It can be in short supply. So often the tension, right, and we let our guard down sometimes and say maybe something we don't want to do. Or we're trying not to break a commitment to ourselves, like not eat that piece of cake. And yet our ability to do so breaks down because Eros and the life force wants us to eat that cake, right? That's another part of us that says don't eat the cake. So again, we have these conflicts that are constantly occurring. Now, if we look at the contemporary kind of psychodynamic perspective, we can look, well, the unconscious, much of mental life is unconscious, or if we want to use the term non-conscious, neuroscience is saying, wow, you know, there used to be, back when Mark was a kid, they used to say, hey, you only use 10% of your brain. And what they meant was you only have conscious control over 10% of your brain. The other 90% of the brain is unconscious, but then we move into the 80s, 90s, we start using the term non-conscious, and now neuroscience in their brain mapping is saying that perhaps only 2% of our brain is devoted to conscious processes, or maybe 98% is devoted to non-conscious processes. So much of mental life is unconscious. Let's say that almost all of mental life is non-conscious. So, and we can still hold on to the idea of psychodynamics in the kind of contemporary psychodynamic perspective. Mental processes operate in parallel to one another. So the desire, right, the need may be operating, but the attempt to inhibit the need might co-occur. So these things happen at the same time, and it sets up a conflict, and one side is going to win and the other side is not going to win in that given situation. That's the dynamic aspect. Now, ego development. Healthy development involves moving from an immature, socially dependent personality to one that's more mature and independent from each other. So as children, we're told, no, don't do that, no, do that. Or like at the beginning when I was telling Quincy to do that because he's being a butthead right now, right? When I tell Quincy, don't do that, the expectation is as we get older and we mature, the don'ts don't come from external forces, that we integrate the rules of society, we integrate our own values, and we let those drive us internally, right? So that, and that's the development of the ego, our ability to inhibit behaviors that we deem inappropriate. And this is something that we judge for ourselves. And then object relation theory. These are mental representations of the self and others that we form in childhood that guide our later social motivations and relationships. So we see that as we learn and we develop this picture of ourself, of which part is our ego development, but as we develop our identity, our self-schemas, etc., that this is in relation to others, other people and other things. So this is how we form those bonds with people and things. And object relations theory allows us to understand those relationships and how those relationships motivate us or demotivate us, how it causes us to inhibit certain behaviors. So there's three contemporary views then of the unconscious. The Freudian unconscious automatically appraises the environment, and that exists. And there's so many examples that kind of support Freud's ideas. For example, a simple phenomenon called the cocktail party effect. Is that if you're in a room with a bunch of people, and let's say there's someone way on the other side of the room, and maybe there's some music playing, and you have 20, 30 people talking, kind of in a party environment, and someone says your name from across the room. Notice, you don't notice any of their conversation until the name, and then the name kind of just jerks your head over. I thought I heard my name, right? How did that come to pass? It's the non-conscious that's monitoring the environment continuously for opportunity and threat, right? Well, Freud knew this, and that is the unconscious is automatically appraising and understanding the environment. Now, the adaptive unconscious sets goals, makes judgments, and initiates actions. So, because we are monitoring the environment and appraising the environment for threat or opportunity, the adaptive non-conscious, or unconscious, if you will, allows us to operate within that environment and maximize our gains and hopefully minimize our punishments, right? By taking appropriate action at appropriate times. And then implicit motivation is automatically attend to emotionally linked environmental events. That is, we place higher value on some events than others, and the non-conscious then pushes those events into the conscious and makes us notice them to a greater extent, right? So we have all these kind of different views of the unconscious. They're probably all an integral picture, a larger picture of how the non-conscious operates. Our economic hypothesis then, psychic energy. If that psychic energy is fixed, that libidinal energy, distribution of energy determines the nature and the outcome of the intrapsychic conflict. So on your good days, when your inhibitory powers are at their max, right, that is, then you might avoid eating the piece of cake, and you might actually motivate yourself to get on, to go out and run or something for your physical benefit if you're trying to lose weight, for example. So it really is who's going to win. It really depends, right? Whether the inhibitory processes had more power going today, or whether it was the motivating and the drive processes that had more power. So the drive-related energy to consume that cake, to have sex, whatever it is Freud called cathexis, right? And the defense-related energy is the counter-cathexis. But the point to always take away from Freud is that we are beings in conflict with drives but inhibitory processes. Fixed amount of energy, so who's going to win really depends who's getting the bulk of the energy. So let's look at this modern day example of ego depletion done by Roy Baumeister. And it's a fascinating study. It's a powerful study. The idea is that this libidinal energy, or the ego energy, if you will, there's only so much, and it can become depleted. Now what will tax this energy? Well, an interesting one that is on the list is choices. That making a choice is difficult. We have to weigh pros and cons, typically, of the various options, and then calculate which is the most desirable given our current state, and perhaps, if we're really thinking deeply, which represents the lowest costs, or at least costs that we're willing to incur. Notice that also, if we look at cognitive dissonance, which we looked at earlier in the course, what Festinger said about cognitive dissonance is if you have to make a choice, right, then as soon as you commit to the choice, what occurs? Do you guys remember? Well, once we make a choice, then the question arises, did I make the right choice? And what are the implications for the self if I made the wrong choice? So, and remember, Festinger said then the splitting of alternatives. What we do then is once we've made the choice we made, we find all the evidence in the world to support making that choice. Good choice, yeah, we rock. And then the choice that we didn't, the choice option that we didn't choose, we find all we can to in fact assure us that in fact that was a bad choice. So we split the difference after the fact to reduce our cognitive dissonance as a result of having to make the choice. Another way to look at choices, suppose you take 3 final exams in a day, you come home and your partner says, congratulations, your final exams are over, I want to make you a dinner, what do you want? And you're laying there on the couch kind of in half days because you've exhausted your libidinal energy, you've depleted your ego, if you want to use that term, and you say, I don't know what I want to eat, just throw some food at me and I'll eat it. Right? So let's talk quickly about this experiment. Self-regulation, that is dieting or not saying something, getting up off the couch to clean the house, whatever it is, initiating or inhibiting behavior. The self's resources are finite. How did Baumeister demonstrate this? Pretty slick experiment. You come into the experiment, you're in the waiting room where most of the experiments take place, right? You're in the waiting room, and it depends the condition you're assigned to. In one condition, there's a big plate of radishes, there's chocolate chip cookies. How do they manipulate the condition? In one condition, they say, hey, enjoy as many radishes as you like, but don't touch the cookies because that's for a different experiment. Or they do the flip side. They say, hey, don't eat any radishes, but enjoy the cookies, as many as you want. Now, which is easier, avoiding radishes or avoiding cookies? The idea was it's easier to avoid radishes than it is to avoid cookies. So now you leave this priming part of the experiment, you go in and you have to attempt puzzles. They're going to measure three things. How long do you spend? How many puzzles do you attempt? Just two things, I'm sorry. The idea is those people who resisted the cookies and used up their energy don't work very long on the puzzles, and they don't try as many. Those people who resist the radishes haven't used up their energy, so they in fact do more puzzles and they spend longer time at it, having not used up their energy. And the control group was simply to make sure that it was in fact resisting cookies that caused the effect, and not the other way around. Enough of that. I'm going to stop it here for a sec and we'll come back.